Well, good morning, everyone. Hello, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for your attention. Please take your seats and so that we can start. I'm Tatiana Kostadinova. I'm professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. I'm also director of the European and Eurasian Studies program with the College of International and Public Affairs, SIPA. Thank you for joining us today for an event which is organized by our program, the European Studies program. We have gathered to discuss recent developments on the old continent, Europe. These developments caught the attention of observers, of scholars, of the general public with its magnitude and complexity. So those complexities involved hundreds of thousands of people who left their homes in the East to seek refuge in the West. They were displaced by violence, by destruction, hunger, lack of conditions to work and live, or simply they lacked the opportunity to survive physically. With the COVID-19 pandemic contained to some extent in the beginning of 2022, Europe faced a series of crises, both expected and unexpected. First, we've had the economic crisis, inflation, an increase in the prices of food and other everyday necessities. Then there has been an energy crisis with rising prices of fuels, driven also by the relations with Russia and the sanctions that were imposed on that country. Then there was the security crisis with a full-scale war that was started by Russia in Ukraine. And as a result, we ended up with a very complicated situation, a migration crisis that brought back memories from 2015, when 1 million refugees escaped the war zone in Syria. Now, to this wave that never ended actually from the Middle East, this time there are also two other flows of refugees that are crossing the European borders. So let me give you just a few numbers so that we can start thinking about the magnitude of this situation. And again, these are according to some accounts. They're not very precise, but still they give us the idea of how many people we are talking about. Since early 2022, about 7.8 or 8 million people left Ukraine. Those were women, children, and elderly who left their country because of the war. Then another close to 1 million Russians left Russia. Some of them were journalists, intellectuals who are fleeing away from the regime of Kremlin. After President Putin declared mobilization, we have also many men who left the country to avoid being mobilized in the Russian army and sent to Ukraine. Also, according to some statistics, the number of attempts made by immigrants from the Middle East and from North Africa to enter the European Union without authorization reached about 330,000 people last year, which is the highest number since 2016. So to better understand the sociological characteristics of these very different flows of refugees, the way they have been received by the national governments in Europe and by the ordinary citizens, by the civil society there. Also, the difficulties that the European Union faced in the attempt to provide these migrants with shelter while protecting their basic human rights. We have invited 3 experts, prolific scholars, who will share their knowledge with us today. I'm very enthusiastic because I have the honor to introduce them to you now. First, we have a guest from Europe. Dr. Jussi Lane is a professor of multidisciplinary border studies at the Karelian Institute of the University of Eastern Finland. He is the president-elect of the Western Social Science Association. He, from 2013 to 2021, he led the Association of Borderland Studies. Professor Lane also serves as project coordinator of Matilde, a 3-year project that is funded by the European Union Horizon 2020 program, which focuses on the impact of migration on local development in rural and mountain regions. By background, Dr. Lane is a human geographer, yet in his approach to borders, he combines knowledge from other fields of science, from international relations and geopolitics, from political sociology, history, anthropology, and psychology. Dr. Lane has published works on border mobility, migration, the ethics of borders, and ontological insecurity. We have also Dr. Russell Lucas. He's currently a professor at the James Madison College, Michigan State University. But I wish to mention also that he used to work at Florida International University. He was a colleague of mine at the Department of Politics and International Relations. He teaches classes on the international relations and domestic politics and culture of the Middle East. His research specializes on this part of the world, the Middle East, its politics, with attention to foreign policy, public opinion, political institutions, and the media. He published a book, Institutions and the Politics of Survival in Jordan, that was published by SUNY Press. He has also published numerous articles in a range of scholarly journals. His current research focuses on conceptions of public opinion in the Arab world. He has previously taught also at University of Oklahoma. We have also Dr. Stephen Roper. He is a professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University. His work is in the area of human rights and transitional justice. He specializes on Eastern Europe. Dr. Roper has served as a consultant to the U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. Department of State, and the World Bank. He is the author of several books and over 50 articles and book chapters. He has just completed, and we are looking forward to seeing the book in print, a co-edited volume marking the 30th anniversary of the war in Moldova. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guests. Before I give the floor to the first presenter, I would like to say that after their presentations, there will be a question and answer session when the audience, you will be given the opportunity to ask questions that are of interest to you so that we can discuss them here together. Now, I would like to invite Professor Lucas to speak and present his talk.
All right, well, thank you, Kostadinova. It's wonderful to be back at FIU. I left about 10 years ago, and it's amazing all the things that have gone on campus and seeing all the developments here and around the city. So it's my pleasure to be back. And so what I wanted to talk about today is the patterns of migration and some of the issues in Europe relating to that. Of migration from the Middle East and North Africa. But first, I wanted to go to the video because there's somebody a little bit more eloquent than me who I think kind of summed up the situation with the Middle East, North African migration and the war in Ukraine.
But I have been glued to the TV all weekend, watching all the news.
This is from February 2022.
And beyond the war itself, I will say this, beyond the war, there's a really interesting thing that I learned. And that is a lot of people on TV didn't expect a war like this to happen in, let's say, certain neighborhoods.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
What could be a difference here from other conflicts, that could seem very far away, in Africa or Middle East or whatever. I mean, these are Europeans that we're seeing being killed.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
Wow. That was you choosing your words carefully? That was the careful version? So what were you going to say if you weren't choosing your words carefully? I just hope the next time this happens, it happens back in the Middle East where it belongs. Here's the thing, people. Here's the thing. Beyond the racism, right? Like, let's forget the racism. Oh, how I wish we could forget about the racism. You do realize that until very recently, fighting crazy wars was Europe's thing. That was Europe's entire thing. That's all of European history. They even had something called the 100 Years' War. You understand how long that is? That's like a decade. They got a Nobel Prize because they stopped fighting. Imagine that. Now people are going to be like, oh, to see this in Europe, to see this. Like, I'll tell you now, I don't know about you, but I was shocked to see how many reporters around the world, by the way, seem to think that it's more of a tragedy when white people have to flee their countries. Because I guess what? The darkies were built for it? I mean, you see how they run in the Olympics, Peter. Clearly, God has given them this talent for a reason. I totally agree. I mean, even if this wasn't a war, these people would probably be fleeing their homes for fun. It's just who they are. Back to you guys in the studio.
All right, back to us in the studio here. So I wanted to start off with this because I think in a lot of ways, it captures the place of migration in the Western imagination about migration from the Middle East to North Africa. And I think, one of the things also that we have to include here is that this is not just migration from the Middle East, North Africa, but also Africa south of the Sahara as well. And I'm not going to be able to talk about that much today. In fact, actually talking about migration from the Middle East and North Africa in and of itself is too big of a topic. And so I'm going to just kind of keep shrinking the scope of what's been going on and talk about a little bit about the background of this. And of course, I think the image, that we keep thinking of is the massive migrations, especially the year 2015, when, millions of people were on the move because of a series of crises that were not necessarily new. So to kind of give an idea of, the countries I'm mainly going to be talking about are going to be Syria, Afghanistan, and of course in 2015 we're not even talking about the crisis in Yemen really yet. That develops later, but also kind of this map from Human Rights Watch talks about kind of some of the major patterns, some of the major sending states, and also kind of in terms of migration to Europe alone, let alone migration within the Middle East as well. So just to kind of talk about some of the crises, and we have to remember that these are, a number of these go back to the beginning of the 21st century, and especially the global war on terrorism. So, the crises of Afghanistan producing a large number of refugees and asylum seekers from 2001, and kind of that pattern of rising and falling crises there. 20 years ago, this month, the United States invaded Iraq, leading to a massive humanitarian crisis that continues until this day, but did have kind of also rise and falls, and especially around the year 2015. Then, of course, the major source of migration has been from the civil war in Syria after 2011. And then in that collapse of the states of Iraq and Syria, you had in the mid-2010s the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, as it's known in the United States. Yemen had its own conflicts in the early 2000s, and then again after 2011, but then 2015 with Saudi intervention. And then the civil war in Libya that developed after the collapse of the government there in 2011. And so, kind of thinking about each of these countries has its own particular history, particular conflicts that are going on inside, and a large number of people who are trying to get out of the way of those conflicts. But the other thing I think it's important to remember, and especially on this kind of 20th anniversary, is how pretty much all of these cases, the United States and or NATO have had a role in either causing that collapse of states and civil wars, or have intervened that to a point where that has accelerated migration. And I think we do need to keep that in mind. Now, some of my colleagues probably will be talking about this a little bit as well, but I do think it's important also to keep in mind that when we're talking about migration, we're talking about different sorts of migration, and especially as we sort through all the different numbers, but kind of differentiating between refugees from asylum seekers, and then kind of a general term of migrant, of people moving for a variety of reasons, but that refugees have particular rights that have been enshrined in international conventions. Asylum seekers are people who are entering a process of claiming the right to migrate. And then, of course, in just kind of a general migration situation, there, of course, is more documented ways of migration and undocumented ways, and multiple causes for this movement of people. And so, keeping in mind still that regardless of whether migrants are documented or not, they still, have human rights upon their points of arrival. And so to keep these in mind, but also to keep in mind that we're talking about different groups of people moving around. So in 2019, before the Ukraine crisis, was one of the high water marks of displacement across the world, even before our current crises. And so, kind of our statistics from the UNHCR, you can see that, 50% of the UNHCR refugees came from 3 countries. Does this do a, oh, there it does. That Syria and Afghanistan, and then the south of Sudan are kind of the 3 leading sources, and a majority of refugees, people who have documented rights or have requested right to be resettled out of those conflicts. So just to give an idea of the scale of 71 million people were on the move, but most of those people actually were just internally displaced, not just, but were internally displaced, people who were out of their homes in conflict zones, but had not left their country of origins. So where did refugees from the Middle East and North Africa go? Well, if we just want to talk about refugees and asylum seekers from Europe, according to the UNHCR, these are the places that Syrian refugees in 2022 had either been registered or had claimed and asked for asylum. And you can see that, this is the limit. Some of the data is limited, but from a low number of 5 to over 6 million. And so most of the single largest place of Syrian refugees displaced were in Syria, or 6,750,000 out of a population of 17.5 million. Turkey is the next largest destination with 3.6 million people out of a population of 85. Lebanon, a population of 5.5 million people, is hosting 831,000 refugees, about 15% of its population. Germany was the next largest host with 710,000 refugees and asylum seekers out of a population of 84.3 million, or 0.8% of the population. Jordan, with a population of 11.3 million, 6% of those, 675,000, were refugees. So 38% of the population of Syria were registered refugees and asylum seekers or at risk. Whereas most other countries, Jordan and Lebanon, were hosting significant populations relative to their own population. And then Turkey is the country outside of Syria that hosted the most refugees. So in Europe, if we look at patterns, and I only had data available from the EU, available to me from 2014, but you can see the kind of, crest and then fall and then once again a rise in migration of, these are first-time asylum seekers. For the first time, the people who are registering for asylum in Europe, any EU state. So most of those, of course, you can see are coming from Syria, but also a significant number from Afghanistan, and lesser so from Iraq, but still a kind of a growing, but still relatively small wave coming from Yemen. So what does this mean? That most refugees are actually staying in either their countries of origins as displaced people, they're migrating to the nearest points, closest to home for them. In the case of Syria, that's Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and then are migrating towards the EU and Europe. And so, of course, I also do want to point out that there's another country that kind of the most desired destination for refugee resettlement is the United States. But as you can think about those numbers on the previous slide, here are this is the total refugee arrival in the United States and their legal limits, the legal limit in blue, the actual arrivals in orange of refugees resettled into the United States since 2008. As you notice, the United States does not take a lot of refugees. In fact, actually, just as a point of reference, I've included a few local and Michigan landmarks that could seat those people in. And frankly, the big house at the other university in Michigan, the largest football stadium in the United States, fits all of those people very comfortably. Probably, in fact, actually Dolphin Stadium can fit most of those. So just as a point of reference for the United States there. But was asked to talk about Europe, so I'll move on to that. So how can we talk about the arrival of this very large wave of refugees from the Middle East and North Africa relative to Europe? And at that point in time, the largest population displacement since World War II up until this past year. Well, I think it's very hard to say, to make a generalization about the reception of migration from Middle East and North Africa in Europe. I mean, on one hand, you have kind of an incredible mobilization, people, individuals, civil society, and governmental and non-governmental organizations kind of gearing up to welcome people who are, fleeing from conflicts, welcoming them, providing for them in ways that are overwhelming to many of the local resources at the points of entry into Europe, especially Greece, Italy, and Malta, as well as parts of Spain, and then through the Balkans. So, I mean, we cannot kind of generalize that migration was unwelcome. Many people were working very hard, dedicating a lot of resources to this. I think where it's even harder to say is how did states react? And in this, we have, very wildly different reactions. Some states were very welcoming and made it a point that migration was something that their state was going to welcome, despite the political costs. And I think Germany, as Angela Merkel's got a fan, But on the other hand, also, countries that were even unwilling to take asylum applications despite their international commitments, and in kind of contrast to later practice, that states would not even welcome asylum seekers or just kind of push them on, use them even for political purposes. I think Hungary, Poland fall into this category. And of course, I think it's important to remember that the migration crisis is compounding an already existing fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. And then as time continues, the kind of EU financial crisis, the COVID pandemic, and then, in the contemporary sense, energy crises, as well as, continued financial crises, and let's not hope a banking crisis to add on top of that. So one of the things I kind of tying this back to how Trevor Noah introduced the subject, is how migration has had a lot of effects. That migration has become not an issue of human rights, but an issue of security. And beyond that, it's not just security, but securitized. That it is a problem that has become, which could be treated as a problem, but that problem is now treated as a threat. And it's kind of simply the other. And so, for example, Shadi Hamid of the Brookings Institution wrote in 2019, today fear of an opposition to Islam or Muslims provides a connective thread uniting otherwise disparate political parties. In Europe, every major right-wing populist party emphasizes cultural and religious objections to Muslim immigration. The bigger issue is that immigrants in question are Muslim, not that they are immigrants. And I think that was fortuitous to talk about as we move forward here, looking to today. Importantly, anti-Muslim sentiment also affects Muslims in the country who are already citizens. The ongoing debate then is less about immigration and more about integration. And I think this is where we kind of have this tie between migration in Europe, out of the Middle East and North Africa, leading to this resurgence of right-wing populism, notably in kind of Hungary and Poland, the Brexit, but also in the United States. And so what this has done is, first of all, created a situation of where migration becomes not just a problem, but a threat. But also it then leads to a kind of lack of initiative and work to solve the crises that are causing migration. The world's and the United States and Europe's inattention to crises that in some cases they either created or exacerbated in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, have gone by the wayside to attempt to remedy those. And then on top of that, the incoherent plans for addressing arrivals. And so I think this is where we can tie back to Trevor Noah. And so in order to wrap up, one of the things that in looking at the issue of Middle Eastern and North African migration in the midst of the Ukraine war is that this has continued an inattention to other conflicts that are already existing. It's reduced assistance that was available or even just promised and not delivered to conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, to the countries like Turkey and especially Jordan and Lebanon that don't have the resources to host the massive refugee populations that they have, to provide assistance for displaced people inside of Syria. That assistance is evaporating. And lastly, I think it's kind of reinforced by this kind of civilizational or racial language that Trevor Noah was making fun of. And then to throw on top of it, an earthquake. So I'm over my time, so I want to stop. Thank you very much.
Professor Lane.
Okay, good morning. It's still morning. Jet lagged coming from Europe yesterday. Thank you, Professor Kostadinova. Thank you to Christine organizing my travels and communicating very efficient manner. Ladies and gentlemen, very good to see you all here and good to be here. I would love to continue where Professor Lucas left off with the secularization of migration, because that is a topic very close to my heart, to the extent that we tend to play with these visuals, and you showed a couple of cartoons, which are usually very effective. I would love to continue on maps on that topic, because what we do in Europe very well, we depict migration as those big red arrows infiltrating the usual blue, calm European space. Maps very similar to war maps that we've been seeing in Europe for the last decades. But I didn't prepare a talk on that, so I will stick with the slides now. But if you want to talk about that, please feel free to ask questions. And thank you for setting up the tone for this presentation. For me, it makes it easier. Defining migration, of course, is the key thing. You very nicely highlighted that there are different kinds of migrants, so we need to be very careful what we talk about. And even amidst the current situation, we easily talk about refugees coming out of Ukraine as well as Russia, whereas many are not coming as refugees and thus not in the statistics. Our university, for example, has hired a number of professors to work at our university from Ukraine during the war, and provided them means to come out. They are not refugees. They are labor migrants in the statistics, but of course they are escaping the war. One point that I also need to say, that I want to say, and I often say in my class, even though we are so fixated on migration, and migration really has become the issue of the decade, if not the century, that most people, a vast majority of the people globally, live in the country in which they were born in. Almost 97% of the global population live in that national box in which they were born in. So migration is not, in those terms, a major issue. We have made it a major issue. And Professor Lucas really highlighted this carefully, that migration has become framed as an important political issue, as a threat, as a security issue, as something to be fought against. But I think I'm, again, deviating from my talk. So, green one. The second point that I want to make, and this is by no means criticism towards the event today, because I make the same mistake all over again, but even in the topic, in the theme and the title of today's presentation, we are talking about 3 waves of migration. And this is a very common rhetoric that I am also guilty myself. I do that all the time, to depict migration akin to a natural force, something that we can't really grasp, something that we can't contain. We talk about our nation states, such as Finland, where I come from, as this one unitary box on the political map of the world, usually colored with a particular crayon, let's say blue, whereas Sweden is yellow and Germany red. And especially if you study political science or political geography, you know these maps on the wall of your classroom or somewhere, and they give you an impression that that is the world out there. But of course, it's not. Many of the social, cultural processes that we are dealing with, they cannot be neatly squeezed into those boxes. And migration is a very, very good example of that. We tend to fight against migration, as was already talked about, rather than focusing on the root causes of that. That was also pointed out. To me, if we would simply challenge the very fact that people somehow automatically come from a certain state, a certain nation, that would alleviate the problems already. Do we belong to that one block on that political map of the world automatically and belong there? I was born in Finland myself, very close to the border with Russian Federation, right? Right now, the passport of Finland is the second most powerful passport in the world, meaning that it gives free access to a very high number of countries in the world. A lot more than US passport, by the way, a lot more, because there are many countries who don't like US, whereas Finland is considered to be as a, unimportant in those sense. So I have to specify that. Okay, so I have a passport of Finland in my pocket, second most powerful passport in the world. Had I been born 30 kilometers, which is, I don't understand miles, 21, 22 miles something like that, east of the place where I was born, I would currently have Russian passport. Most likely, I would not be addressing you today in this room. So that very fact where I was born has continued to provide me opportunities to define my career, define my opportunities, and my life completely arbitrary fact. Some random politicians way back drew a line, and this is Finland, this is Russia, right? Okay. Anyway, power words, waves, floods, tsunami, tide. This is how we talk about migration as something that we cannot contain. And when we need to enforce our nation states, make them more solid, build walls. Some countries are building walls on their borders as to try to more carefully contain the migration flows or waves. So what I'll be talking about today is already what Professor Kostadinova introduced, the war in Ukraine that was started by President Putin. That is his war in February last year. A lot of Ukrainians have been leaving, more than 8 million already, as said, but also a lot of Russians. And I'm going to talk about quite a bit about Russia today. Ukrainians has really witnessed this very immense welcoming solidarity approach in Europe. And I'm going to talk about that. That, of course, is very understandable. I very much support that. There are real reasons for that, but there is a lot of racist reactions in that as well. It reveals a lot of structural discrimination within Europe for the very reasons that you showed on the YouTube clip. Whereas Russians have, of course, been taken a lot with the mixed feelings, with the quite a bit of reservation, but also downright Russophobia, which has surfaced, which has been there, I would argue, simmering under the surface for quite a long time. But now the political climate allows people to say those things aloud that 4 or 5 years ago would have been considered as politically incorrect things to say. So certainly, excuse me, double standards. Attitude towards the Ukrainian refugees is fundamentally different from the attitudes towards refugees from the countries that were just talked about: Yemen, Syria, Palestine, Afghanistan, for example. What the European Union has done, and Europe as a whole, is really politicized the response to refugees from Ukraine as to basically punish Russia by showing this overwhelming solidarity towards Ukraine. And as such, this is the right thing to do, in my opinion, but it completely hides the fact that the other refugees are paying the price from that. They are not treated the same way, but considered as more and more threat. The response reflects geographical and geopolitical and racist considerations, and simply skin color, language, religion issues that were already pointed out played a huge role in here. Why? I think we are using the same sources. Why we are considering the issue as a very severe at the moment is that we see people like us fleeing from their home countries. People with many blonde hair, blue eyes, that is quite often said. That is a lot more striking than the images that we have used to see in the media for the last 10 years. And this is really striking and needs to be discussed. Again, this time war is wrong because people look like us. It's not a poor, remote country anymore. It's really emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. And that is what causes the very different kind of reaction. If we think about the numbers, you can see that the biggest wave indeed took place right after the war, but it has been remaining rather stable ever since then, and already now we see numbers more than 8 million who have left their homes in Ukraine. Quite many in the neighboring countries, but Germany, again, here being a very welcoming country, sees very high numbers. The bars in blue are the percentage, and the actual figures are then indicated in numbers in this file. The file is a little bit old. It says under 8 million, but it's now already over from that. Here, it is important to think or remember that talking about this very state-centric way also hides many of the nuances. We tend to say, and I just did, that Germany is very welcoming, some other countries are not, which is actually quite incorrect, because many of the European countries are increasingly internally torn. And that is, in my mind, the biggest security threat in Europe, that Europe has really become increasingly torn. You can see the two different sides within many of the states fighting against one another. So when people ask about what people think in Europe or what they do think about in Finland, it's very difficult for me to say, because I have no idea what would be the obvious average opinion to say. It has become increasingly torn and divided as a continent. I don't know what the font has changed to something a lot cooler from what I did, but indeed more than 8 million people. You can see that if you look at the age brackets there on the right upper right hand corner, you can see that mainly female. Of course, most of the men have been are fighting at the war, so it's hard for them to leave the country. Whereas then if you look at the children under 18, there it is a lot more even balance, and the numbers are indeed going down. Those who could flee the country, they did so quite soon after the beginning of the war, but by no means is the inflow or outflow from that perspective over. So the discrimination is something that is also discussed quite a bit. I took a couple of examples. These are older ones. I mean, the pictures that I have incorporated in my slide. This is from the so-called refugee crisis 2015. And why I do that is that, in my understanding, we didn't have a refugee crisis. We had a political crisis. We chose to define certain things as a crisis. The most prosperous continent in the whole world could not handle 1 million people, which is, to me, is a joke. Right now, we are easily handling 8 million people, and nobody is really complaining. 2015, we were saying that our societies cannot survive with 1 million people. So should there have been a political will, the situation in 2015, 2016 would have not been a crisis. But again, I feel like I'm repeating myself here already, but even though we are very proud about the welcoming approach towards Ukrainian solidarity, at the same time, European Union is pushing back the migrants from other countries, being very passive about situation in the Mediterranean, actually shooting refugee boats in the Mediterranean. The border of the European Union, the external border of the European Union, has become the most lethal border in the whole world, right? And we are talking about a European Union which, as pointed out, received a Nobel Peace Prize recently, is an institution, is a union based on values, none of which are negative. Usually the European values are all the nice words: democracy, rule of law, what have you not, solidarity. But at the same time, we are not really acting based on the values. So the value base of the union is being hollowed out in my view. So, but Russia, and I think this is important because this is less talked about at the moment. And of course, I come from a country that shares a long border with Russia, 1,300 kilometers. Again, I don't know, no miles along a border. And this was very interesting because right after the war started, immediately quite many Russians left the country. In our case, when most of the flights were stopped, many of the connections, the rail line between Helsinki and St. Petersburg remained open for another 3 weeks. after that, and that really became an avenue for a lot of Russians to escape. Of course, you know, they were very much afraid what is going to happen to them, especially if they were critical towards the current administration, critical towards the war. Russia was not really an easy place to be, and various laws were changed that would allow you to put into a prison for 15 years or sent to somewhere else. A lot of people were actually quite afraid of their lives and livelihoods, and tried to escape. As well, the military mobilization spurred many men to escape, who did not want to go and fight at the war. It's hard to say how many. People estimate that approximately 1 million Russians have left. It's difficult to say because a lot of also have a dual citizenship, and they are not considered in those ways. For example, our university has a lot of Russian professors working who has a dual citizenship. They have, of course, all the right to continue their work. But the point is that there has been a huge outflow, and these are the people who can leave. They are very skillful people, very educated people, right? The people who could have made a change in Russian society. Most of those have left. They have connections in the West. They have come here. They've come to Finland. The various parts in Europe. Dubai is apparently packed of that. So really the working class young population and working age, not working class, working age and young population, well educated, have left, and that is going to have a long-lasting effect on the Russian society for sure. So what you see at the, I took there's a couple of pictures from the Finnish-Russian border. They even established this, excuse me, mobile mobilization enlistment offices at the border. So for those men after the war who tried to leave Russia and come to Finland, they were trapped at the border and sent to fight in Ukraine before they were able to escape to Finland. And you can see what kind of motivation you have after that to fight, which is probably something that you've been reading in the news. This is a Finnish store, Finnish-owned store, a huge brand in St. Petersburg, where you can see the impact of the sanctions. There's nothing on the shelves, something very similar that you could have seen earlier during the Soviet times. Then the visas were banned, and then the border basically closed completely, and now we are building a wall there. I'm sorry, it seems like I have my slides in the wrong order. This was what I talked about already about the nation or state-centric responses. So it seems that there are differences. There are state differences and differences within states. But you can see easily a distinction here with the countries who actually neighbor Russia, where the presence and impact of Russia is really there on everyday basis. When you are a little bit further away, such as Germany, you don't have to react on every single thing, and you can think about a little bit what you do. But when you are right there at the border, the impact is rather severe, and you can see that the most maybe hardest change in rhetoric has been in those countries. Finland in particular, that used to be very, very diplomatic, tried to be somewhat neutral, even though during the last years the neutrality had been gone still, but still very diplomatic in disagreeing with Russia. And now the attitude has changed fundamentally to a very blatant, open criticism. And you can see the reasoning here, especially in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, especially, where the foreign ministers in the respective countries have been saying very, very clearly that Russia is basically a state sponsor of terrorism. There's a genocide going on, and hence we need to take a very, very strong reaction to that. Now, in Finland, this is how the diplomacy was taking place for the last 10-15 years. This is our president, Sauli Niinistö, playing ice hockey together with President Putin. just a couple of years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago. But they used to do this almost annually. Even though they disagreed with most of the things, there was a very direct dialogue between the presidents, and you could see that even Mr. Trump came to Finland to meet Mr. Putin rather than to Moscow, and Niinistö was sort of a mediator in that debate. Now, when the war started, his argument was that the mask has now come off and only the cold face of war is visible. And I took one picture from the Finnish media, because these are the maps. We started with the migration this talk, and I referred to the war maps, but we are using again these very classical Second World War imaginaries, how the Russian tanks would be coming slowly to the Finnish border, and we are wondering how to react to that. Now a decision has been made to build a fence on the wall, on the border. For the last 10 years, we've been laughing at certain countries who have been building the wall. President Trump was openly criticized and humiliated by the Finnish politicians, and now we are doing exactly the same thing. This is how politics work. And why I show this here after the previous file is that these two issues, migration and now the war, has been fused somehow together, right? The wall at the border started as a reaction to the situation at the border between Belarus and Poland, and Belarus and Lithuania more than a year ago, where Belarus was pushing migrants from third countries across the border as a means of a sort of a hybrid warfare. And the Finnish state are like, oh, this could happen to us, we need to react somehow. But back then, the fence did not get any support. Like, why would we build a fence? The border runs nothing but forests and lakes, and nobody's really there. But then the war started, and immediately all the parties were supporting the fence because of the war. And even in the media, they are showing these tanks at the border and saying that we need to prepare and we need the fence, as if the fence would somehow stop the Russian tank. But it's going through in the public very, very, very well. It's somehow etched in the very nationalistic minds of where Finns that Russia is a threat, and we need to do something against that. And if you use that argument, if you play the Russian card, you can get by any kind of a random idea that you might have with that. Now, back to the war. Here, the stance, and here I'm talking about Finland, has been very, very strong, very supportive. Our prime minister have been going there, I don't know how many times, but really trying to show support. We are sending tanks. We are sending now apparently the trains that used to run between Finland and Russia. There's now debate if we would send those trains to Ukraine. We are sending apparently fighter jets, which is still debatable, of course, but something that was completely unheard of in the past. And all this is happening has been happening in the last years, where the Russians are fleeing mostly to the neighboring countries: Georgia, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Turkey. These are countries that are neighboring Russia, but are not part of the European Union. It's a little bit more difficult to come to the European Union because the attitude is very negative, very critical. We have a lot of sanctions, and of course, many of the European countries are very expensive places to be in. But still, in Finland, we see quite a bit of Russians as well, and often now being accommodated even in the same premises where the Ukrainian refugees are accommodated, which creates a very interesting setting locally and needs to be managed. There are three phases of this, and I'm trying to rush through because I understand that my time is up. But you can really see that right at the beginning, after the war started, it was basically a lot of journalists, politicians, very high-tech people who had the means to leave immediately from the country. A little bit later, 3-4 months later, it was more the middle and upper middle class people. Many had to wait that their children finished the school year. For example, you really see a spike when the school came to an end in the beginning of the summer, and then they could leave the country. A lot of people who had their businesses, they had to figure out what to do with their businesses before they could leave the country. And then the third wave, I'm going to use the word wave, really when the military mobilization started, I believe in September 2021, when we can see that more and more men in that particular age bracket try to leave the country. And I'm going to stop with this one because I wanted to include this. This is a gentleman working at my institute in UNC who's a Russian, who is accommodating both Ukrainian refugees at his own house and also Russians, military-aged men who have been fleeing the country. And it's really nice to see how they are actually getting along really, really well, and trying to show and enforce the picture that even though I think the polls show that 70%, 75% of the Russian population actually do support Mr. Putin's war, not everybody do so. And when you live at the border, we need to think ahead. Russia is going to be there in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, like it or not. And if we now completely cut the ties to the entire society, it is going to be very, very difficult future ahead. So we are trying to create and maintain the connections to those people who are openly against the war. Thank you so much for your time.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was thinking as I was speaking to one of the students in the comparative class before we began, it's wonderful to see so many students here. And I'll have to, when I go back to my class tomorrow, tell them that the comparative politics students here are more interested and motivated in these sorts of issues than they are at FAU. So hopefully that will engender a little bit more participation in these types of events. I want to thank Professor Kostadinova for inviting me here, and for all of the sponsors, and for Christine for all her assistance as well. This is, we've got only a few minutes, and I'm mindful that there's been a lot of issues that have been brought up that you might want to ask questions about, or that you may want to contribute in your own way. So I'm going to go through some slides fairly quickly and point out maybe some of the issues that the other panelists have discussed, but I want to make sure to wrap up sooner so that you have an opportunity to ask your questions. And it's striking to me, when you think about this discourse on migration, and I think Professor Lucas was right to talk about the different ways in which we speak about these individuals. Are they asylum seekers? Are they migrants? Are they refugees? And this sort of discourse plays very much into what we see going on in our own domestic politics, and certainly here in South Florida. So a lot of the issues that we're talking about, issues about racism, issues about response, these are issues that we face in the United States as well. So let's see, is it, yeah. Oh, it is, here we go. So we, again, the number's been banted around this over 8 million refugees, but it's really an immense number for us to really think about in terms of the response that these state governments had to create, the response of the European Union as well. And if you just kind of look at the numbers, again, you see individuals in different types of classifications here. But some of these countries that were noted as being very mixed in terms of their responses to migrants from the MENA, have been countries that have been opening their doors actually to the Ukrainian refugees. And you see really a real difference in the way these individuals are being treated. And particularly if you look at a country such as Poland, which hosts about 1.5 million of the Ukrainian refugees, and you compare that response of the Polish government to these refugees as compared to the refugees from Tunisia, from Syria, from North Africa, you see a stark difference. And the same goes even with Hungary. Even though the numbers are much smaller, the response of the government has been fundamentally different. I'll just go through a couple. And the other thing for us to emphasize is that while we tend to talk about countries such as Poland or Germany, the reality is that this is a European problem, it's a European issue, and that the solutions are within Europe as well. As you see, the refugees that are in these different countries range from some fairly low numbers to some fairly high numbers, but it's really across the board within the context of Europe. And one of the fascinating things about this refugee crisis, and it's been noted, I think, is that approximately 90% of the refugees are women and children and the elderly. And this has created its own compounding problems as you've had families ripped apart, which is very, unfortunately, a standard in these kind of migration patterns. But you've had a particular crisis in that you're trying to protect women, you're trying to protect children, and this leads to some of the unintended terrible consequences that we start seeing of human trafficking, for instance, of children trafficking that is going on with this particular wave. The international response has been enormous with the Ukrainian refugees. You've seen an outpouring by UNHCR, IOM. I'll talk a little bit more about the EU. So we've seen that the international community has been motivated and has been engaged in a way that we've not necessarily seen in other refugee migration patterns within Europe or within other countries as well. And because I think of the sensitivity of thinking about, again, this 8 million number is massive, but if you think about who these people are and to think about the fact that these are, again, are women with children bringing their elderly parents, the UNHCR and UNICEF, which has been very, very active in this crisis because it's been very child focused, have created what they call blue dot centers. These are especially organized to assist these kind of families, as well as for individuals who have disabilities. That's another issue that has really come to the forefront, as well as, again, trafficked persons. And I'll speak a little bit about that. Trying to, again, take this aggregate number and really contextualize it as to who these people necessarily are. The EU response, I think, has been fundamentally different than what we have seen go on in the last 15 years in regards to the MENA refugees. This new pact on migration and asylum, which came out of the process of the last few years of countries such as Italy and Greece being the point of entry for EU, has, I think, really focused the EU on this particular issue. And has really highlighted, I think, some of the problems with the customs and the border policing that has gone on. I think, as Professor Lane noted, there has been created for the first time ever, and only applied to the Ukrainians, this temporary protection directive. And again, just another example of where the Ukrainian refugees are being treated differently than others, no matter, again, what their status is. Whether they are claiming some sort of asylum or refugees. And these provide very specific benefits. So what the European Union tried to do was to speed up the process because, again, you had this just huge outpouring of individuals to provide for the housing, to provide for social welfare, to provide for employment. And if you can imagine, in many of these cases, these are aspirations that are very difficult to achieve simply because you've got individuals who are coming in who simply do not speak the language, do not have necessarily the job skill set. Again, we're talking about women who are also having to be caregivers at the same time. And so And also something that's very interesting is, again, just trying to provide state education. And speaking to colleagues in Europe, now there's whole classes, right, of just Ukrainian refugees, and trying to assist those young people in terms of their type of integration within their societies. And while aspirational, I think the European Union has done a much better job dealing with Ukrainian refugees than in prior refugee crises, if you will. There has been, again, a lot of criticisms of how this has necessarily been applied. Some of these are logical because of the language barriers and access to education. Others have been due to just simply the enforcement and the ways in which different countries have implemented this particular directive. And the problem is within the context of this directive, if kind of one domino does not fall, so to speak, then the other dominoes do not. And so it creates really a lot of bureaucratic snafus for individuals in terms of actually being able to have access to the rights that they have. So one of the things that I work in the former Soviet Republic of Moldova. Moldova has really been at the center of a lot of these discussions. And what's been very interesting is kind of looking, for those of you who've studied the European Union, it's a highly bureaucratic organization with lots and lots of different moving pieces. It's been interesting to see the response within Moldova as you've had the European Union try to coordinate these different agencies to provide that type of coverage. And some of the intended problems that go just simply with the bureaucracy of actually delivering services. And I think has already been noted, I think, by Dr. Lucas, the initial concern was just simply, processing individuals, just simply, dealing with the intended problems that come with the refugees at the border, making sure these people had some sort of housing, food, clothing, and so forth. And so, as we saw with some of the numbers by Dr. Lane, that you had that huge, when the war began, that huge number that hit. Although again, it's the numbers are still pretty impressive. But now what we've seen is a turn away from kind of the human face and human rights issues to now a discussion about border issues. And so this is no longer, even within the Ukrainian refugee crisis, is no longer seen necessarily as dealing with kind of these human rights issues fundamentally. But now the EU and member states are focusing more on what they call the second wave issues. And those second wave issues are the ones that involve, again, the use of this crisis by organized crime, whether we're talking about arms smuggling, human trafficking, child trafficking, drug smuggling, and so forth. And so that it has become now a security issue rather than a human rights issue. And that, I think, has gone to, I think Dr. Lane was talking about, is maybe some of the fatigue that we see going on with different governments a year on, is that the initial response and enthusiasm to help now is being focused much more on protecting the state borders as opposed to helping individuals. And again, as has been mentioned by both panelists, right, I think that we see a stark difference in the way that these refugees have been treated vis-a-vis in previous crises. And so again, if any of you want to have questions, I'm sure that will be a discussion. And compounding that, again, for many of these countries, particularly for a country like Moldova, is just simply the economic burdens that they have when dealing with these particular types of crises. And so you've got some very vulnerable economies that are undergoing. This is a photo of the previous government that fell last month. It's the first government to fall really due to the crisis. And you see that there is a lot of, Moldovans are very, very sympathetic, very supportive of the Ukrainian refugees. Many of them are actually ethnically Ukrainian themselves. Many of them can speak to them. So it's a very unusual, different situation you might find in other European countries where many of them do speak Russian. But at the end of the day, the economic burdens has been such a great strain in this particular country that it's led to the fall of the government and a real soul searching as to whether or not they've been too open with the Ukrainian refugees. So I just will finish off because again, I want to be very mindful for those of you who've come that you to have your questions, that this crisis, I think, is going to have a huge, broad impact, much greater than what we have even witnessed this past year. and that ultimately it's going to call into question, again, this whole issue of borders, this whole issue of security, and move away, unfortunately, I think sometimes from the human dimension of what we've been seeing to much more of a political discourse on the other. And it'll be interesting to see over this next year how this refugee crisis becomes much more of a political and security crisis. Thank you so much.
I would like to open it now for a discussion and questions. Please, when you ask your questions, briefly introduce yourself. Would be much appreciated, and ask the question so that the panelists would be able to respond. Yeah.
Please.
Your name.
Yeah.
Are you students are you students?
Yes, comparative politics, Professor Rose.
All right.
So my name is Jordan, and so I wanted to ask. So I know that Finland's education system, specifically high school, not really college, but high school, middle school, elementary, like public education, right, has been deemed, kind of the best in the world. How do you think that the education system is handling educating kids about these topics? Like for one of the world's greatest education system, how do you think? I mean, do you know how they're handling? And if you do, then how do you think if it's good or bad, or what should be changed? But if you don't really know, then what do you think that they should be doing? Trying to.
I hear you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question. The education system indeed has been doing really, really well for a long time. I think there has been challenges within that system already before the current war situation. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I don't think we are at the top anymore. I mean, we are still very high, but I think we were the top for a number of years in a row. But there have been a lot of cuts towards education already for the last 6-7 years due to the previous crisis that you listed. There are quite many crises, and this is basically like hammering one crisis after another, and we have multiple crises at the same time. So that's the first part. How the education system is handling the current situation, that's hard to say. I do have two kids who are at the school, and they do discuss about these topics quite well. So I can't really complain in that terms. What I can say in general is that through the education, most Finns have a very, very good media reading skills, meaning that people understand that what is written in the media is not the truth necessarily. And people are encouraged to really formulate their own opinion based on facts and personal experiences. I think that applies to many topics, not just this one. But it's very uncommon that you simply read the yellow press and take the opinions from there and then consider those of your own. But we have grown. Well, now things are a lot more open-minded and liberal, but still I used to grow in a climate where many things were unsaid, but still understood, especially regarding Russia. You couldn't say certain critical things aloud, but everybody knew what they were. And even young kids were taught to think this way. And I think it has pros and cons, but I think the education system really encourages people to find out the facts before they consider something as true.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First, I just wanted to thank you guys for coming here and speaking to us. My name is Logan Crane. I'm a student of political science. I'm currently in Dr. Eris's comparative politics class. So, Dr. Lucas, you spoke about cultural integration being one of the key issues that was used to paint immigration as a problem. But then, Dr. Roper, you brought up what I wanted to ask about, which was economic integration being a key issue, especially as in the latest wave, migrants that might not have the necessary skills or education or even cultural ties to the nations they're migrating to are coming into the workforce. If we could speak predictively, how do you all expect that over the next 5, maybe 10 years, these waves of migrants will be able to integrate economically into the countries they're migrating to? And if that fails or is a success, how do you think that could affect the view of migration in a country like the US?
Okay, I guess I can, of course, the two processes are really interrelated. And so I think, thinking about, someone who is arriving in a country where, first of all, there's linguistic issues. And so really does kind of factor in of, in terms of the person's age, their pre-existing job skills. Are they students, young families? And then I think, as you mentioned, in terms of whether they're caregivers, taking care of young children, elderly, especially in the case of, women who are migrating without, their entire family with them. So I think these, and what we've seen over the past, decade or so with Middle Eastern and North African migration is, the countries that are willing to take on the investment of offering resources for integration, especially linguistic and then job skill training. Those pay off. And so that group then is able to become active members of the labor force, taxpayers. And, one of the other statistics that's out there, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but especially in the United States, of migrants are often, they have taken great risks already in their lives and are therefore have an inclination towards entrepreneurial initiatives. And so therefore often become, entrepreneurial members of the business community if that's something that they're having the skills to do already. So I think this is, it really does depend on how the state is looking at issues of cultural integration and how those link into economic integration. Is it an investment or is it a welfare burden? So I'll pass on.
I guess I would also just, add to that. In interviews with many of the Ukrainian refugees, they would think in 5 years that they would be back in Ukraine. They do not intend to stay in these countries. So they are different than some other individuals who have left for economic reasons as part of war-torn countries. These are individuals who are fleeing a war, and at least among many of them, they have no intention of necessarily staying. So the issues are not so much of economic integration for job skill purposes, let's say 5 years down the road. It's much more the social burden right now that these states have to endure because of the fact that these are individuals who, again, are caregivers, oftentimes either of younger children or of older family members, and are not necessarily looking at, developing themselves through employment practices. These are women who maybe had careers back in Ukraine, but are not looking at, having a career necessarily in this particular country. Maybe that's what also makes this a very interesting dynamic is once the war ends, where do we see these people going? And my guess is, at least by the anecdotal evidence and interviews, these are people who plan on rebuilding and going back home.
I see. Thank you.
If I can add something, just a sentence before we get the next question. There are two basic characteristic features that make these different groups different. The ones coming from the North Africa and the Middle East, and the ones coming from Ukraine, and that this is one of the reasons also why they're being accepted in a different way domestically. It has a lot to do with domestic politics as well, because one thing is, if you look at them, and the panelists mentioned this, these are women and children who are fleeing from Ukraine. On the other side, the ones coming from North Africa and the Middle East are primarily men, young men at a certain age between 15 and 35. And this is what brings a lot of conflict in these European societies, because there is one group in society who considers it, because it's insecurity. They're bringing insecurity. They say, well, women and children will understand they are fleeing from the war. These are real refugees. The other ones are not refugees. They're coming here to threaten us somehow because also of the different bomb attacks in after 2001 and so on and so forth. So this is one thing. The other thing is, as Professor Roper mentioned, the fact that many of the Ukrainian refugees say they want to go back to their country. So this again plays on domestically on the public over there, who are ready to accept them readily because they don't feel that their social security and their social programs would be threatened in the long run because of a permanent presence of this group.
I mean, I just want to add one more thing. And I think part of that is because, for example, the Syrian refugee family, may be dislocated to Turkey. And so or Jordan or Lebanon. And so similarly, the women and children fleeing, they're staying at places close to home. And I think whereas, younger men who are of able working age then are taking the opportunity to migrate for political refugee reasons, but also for economic reasons. Because, Jordan's economy was frankly devastated before the war. Lebanon is, the country's economy has evaporated. And so I think, these countries are unable to support an additional labor force in the country as well. And so that's why another reason why young men are sent to work as well. So, and the one last thing I do think is, unfortunately for a lot of, Syrian, Afghani refugees, they would love to go home, but there's no country to go back to. The country has been destroyed. And I think that's another big issue that the Ukraine so far has successfully avoided so far.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm an international relations major from Dr. Washington's class on refugees and migrations. And my question is for Dr. Lucas. So if there's an anti-migration sentiment, then there's no incentive to solve the crisis that caused migration in the first place, like you said. However, at the beginning of the slides, I also saw a bullet point that argued that the US and NATO were intervening negatively in how the conflict started. So my question would be, how do you think we can intervene to stop the root problem of migration, but not negatively?
Well, I think that, it's a really good question. Well, I think President Obama summed it up well as don't do stupid. So I think, and I think this is for, with the United States, especially here, that, in some ways, the United States is not dealing with migration problems that it created with the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Afghanistan was much more politically, opinion was much less divided on that, but it's still there. And, for example, even after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the number of refugee arrivals from Afghanistan the United States permitted in was still abysmally small. And so I think, this is, so, perhaps a more careful thinking about the US's role in the world that, the consequences of which were not going to necessarily be, were not thought about, say, in 2001, 2003. And still, in the United States' role in the war in the Ukraine, this is not, what is the United States going to do in regards to Ukrainians who are fleeing their homes or providing refuge for Russians who are opposed to the government? This is not a part of the calculation. And so, I think one of the things to do is maybe at least put that as part of the calculation, and what are the other resources that were available for U.S. foreign policy to pursue. So,
Thank you.
thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Anas Ibrahim, and I'm also from Dr. Washington's class, and I'm also part of the Model UN team at FIU.
Oh, great.
So, and first of all, wonderful lectures. And my question is basically as you mentioned, the Ukrainian refugees have a similar culture, maybe a similar identity as Finland and other countries in Europe. So do you think there's a lack of knowledge regarding the Middle East and the Northern African culture, or also their country's political ideology that plays a role in terms of the viewership of those people who are coming from those countries, basically migrating towards in Europe and EU, basically? Anyone can answer.
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, there is a lack of knowledge and information. I think it's quite logical that people are more aware of the situation surrounding the place where they live in. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I am more familiar with the region that I live than other parts of the world. But I think there's again, the personal experience part here plays a role, because when you have more personal knowledge, you know the people, you visit the country, you create certain attachments to that, and you see them as people, as one of you react to their suffering very differently. Whereas much of the earlier refugee flows were discussed as in very inhumane way, as this mass of people without names, without personality, just coming towards Europe. And when you don't consider somebody as basically as a human being, but as a threat, your reaction can be very harsh to that. If I know you personally and I can see your suffering, of course I'm going to react different way than to a something that I'm not aware of. So yes, the lack of information does play an important role for sure.
One more question then.
Hi, well, my name is Pauline. I'm French and I'm here on exchange. I'm also part of Dr. Washington class. Well, I have two questions, but they're really short. My first question is, what do you think European countries, as you said, that this issue is not anymore a question of human rights, but more of political discourses. For the future, what do you think European countries should do to turn this issue into more of a human rights issue and not political discourses? So this is the first question. And the second question is, do you think that the European Union could have given the same response they give to the Ukrainian crisis, this response to the all the inflows of refugees since the 2000s?
So, you know, how do we refocus away from this being a political issue to a human rights issue? And I think that is a struggle for every government and every country within the European Union. It's a struggle here in the United States as well. And, you know, at the same time that you see, for instance, in a country like Great Britain, there's been a welcoming of Ukrainian refugees. At the same time, you have the Interior Minister creating now charter flights, right, to send people to Rwanda. And there's now even talk of Great Britain leaving the European Court of Human Rights over this particular issue. And so this is, I think, an eternal struggle that countries, that governments have. And this is really, I think, the importance and something maybe we tend to be very, as I think Dr. Lane said, we tend to be very state-centric. This is really where civil society plays a huge role in terms of mobilizing against dehumanizing what has been going on. And that is, I think, what we see playing out in places such as France or places Great Britain. And we'll be seeing this kind of struggle between civil society, between the state, and you know, is this a security issue? Is it a human rights issue? How do we define the other, or are they the other? there's no answer to it. I think we've seen that this is going to be this is a very long, protracted problem. And again, just look at the way we deal with it in the United States. The way we deal with it is oftentimes to stick our head in the sand. So I think this is something that will be seeing time for some time.
I think that was an excellent answer. I'm not going to add much to that, but it's important to understand that we tend to blame the governments, especially in Europe, right? But who elects those governments? They're the people. And what you can see in Europe, that it's getting increasingly populist, increasingly right-wing politics. We have an elections on Sunday, and the party called that used to be called True Finns, telling already, and they changed their names, the Finns. They even removed the truth that, you know, if you are Finn, you should vote for us. And they have a very ethnic understanding of what Finnishness is. You need to be white, you need to talk Finnish, you need to believe in one particular god, and that's basically it. And you need to love ice hockey. And if you don't match that, I mean, you can be very beneficial for the society, but you are not one of us. And this is a reaction to your first question, is that how to focus on the human rights or bring it more human rights issues, that it's difficult when you don't have the support for that. I mean, here we have a bunch of academics telling you that that's the right way of doing. But if you go to any European city and you stop first 10 random people on the street and ask the same questions, you will get very different answers. And that is the problem that indeed I wanted to underline, by the European societies becoming increasingly divided and torn.
Hi, my name is Leanna Monem, and I'm a part of Dr. Arias' class. I'm a liberal studies major. My question is, well, kind of going back, we know that from 9/11, there, especially in America, increased the amount of Islamophobia like internationally. And from that, I think my question is basically, do you think that the US intervention in the Middle East and kind of like the racism towards migration from the Middle East and Northern Africa, like internationally all around the world, came from, you know, trying to have, it's kind of like a military tactic, kind of trying to have the enemy inside or see the enemy's way of thinking and kind of trying to control it rather than trying to help and intervene and give, you know, the US resources towards it. What are your opinions about it?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, the two things go hand in hand, of kind of, you know, Islamophobia, of, you know, 9/11 was a great shock to the United States. And, you know, it was, and, you know, a lot of those features already existed. And a lot of those features existed in reference to other groups that were foreigners, others, threats, culturally unlike the United States, and of different races from the United States, as if the United States had a single race. And for some people, that's kind of the normative idea that it should. And so it wasn't operating out of, it just didn't come out of, you know, nowhere, or just something new on September 11th. It was building on past practices of racial discrimination. And so I think, you know, this is, the two things then go together, is that this is an external threat that's coming inside, which of course is the most fearful threat that you can have, is that, you know, your security at home is being threatened by the other outside. And so, you know, a lot of this discourse built in the United States, built on previous, you know, fears. And so I think, you know, that the United States policy could have been pursued very differently, you know, and just kind of, I'll just be I can go on forever. You're lucky you didn't take my classes 10 years ago. But, you know, think about it this way. We had a war on terror, okay? We were on a crusade to defeat the enemy, okay? Now, imagine a world where instead this was we were pursuing organized crime who are mass murderers, and we are going to bring them to justice. This is a very different world we live in, of that, this would be based on collaborative policing, and, it still would be about security. And I'm not saying, that, security services, police services are not guilty of over exaggeration, but it would not have become militarized. And it would have been very distinguishing between, here are people who are committing acts of violence, they are criminals, and here are law-abiding people, citizens who want to live their lives and contribute to the community. This is going to be a very different world that we live in. And that was a choice, whether this was a war on terror or whether this was capturing a criminal.
One more question.
Let's take one.
Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Amina. I'm with the Currency Direct, Foreign Exchange and International Money Transfer Company. My question is, so when a country accepts and open doors to refugees, immigrants, or whoever, do they have in place a program, a financial program that doesn't interfere with the citizen? Because in every country, they do have a rate of unemployment, they do have issues of safety, of course. How do they manage that? Do they have actual a program? For example, like in Portugal, they offered the golden visa, and now they are having issues with the Chinese because they bought a lot of pieces of land, and now it will be like 3 months and they have to close it. So how they are dealing with that? Thank you.
I can say something. That's a big one. Many countries who accept refugees, they do have policies for that, various integration policies. The issue is how well they are implemented, actually. And there was, I think, a gentleman asked a question about the economic integration, which is related to yours. And what we can see is that quite many refugees have very high skill level. And many of the skills would be very useful for the new host societies, right? Europe in particular is getting increasingly old. The birth rates are very low. So the number of retirees is very high. And I think the Northern European is the most drastic example because, like no new babies whatsoever is basically being born, and population is getting older and older. And we really need more people in those countries. At the same time, we have very strict migration policies, which doesn't really make sense. And even we recognize that people come with skills, but our own structures basically hinder social mobility. We can have engineers, we can have doctors, physicians coming in, but our structures do not allow us to utilize those skills. But we force them to clean or do something. And imagine yourself in that kind of position. If you have a doctorate and you've been a very important person in your country and you go to another country and you are cleaning the floors, that affects you. So the policies exist, but I don't think they are not very flexible, usually for a reason, for political reasons, and they are not well implemented.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that you have more questions. Absolutely, because we opened the discussion and then other issues started to pop up in our minds. And but I promise you that we'll continue the conversation in the future. Please join me in giving a warm applause of thank you. Thank you very much for attending today. Thank you very much for your interesting presentations. And have a very good day. And I wish you all the best at the end of the semester.
You. You as well.